The gravest mistake a company can make is, well, from a PR standpoint, telling the truth about their intentions, because their intentions are just always nefarious. They don't aim ultimately to serve consumers. They aim to serve themselves, the corporation, the entity. And Ubisoft recently essentially gave the middle finger to gamers as a whole. And this is on top of an already precarious situation where their stock price is the lowest it's been since like 2012, sitting at less than $2. Beyond that, they're trying to kind of like make reparations to investors by starting up this like new subsidiary that will house Assassin's Creed, Far Cry, and Rainbow Six, their big three IPs, and get some investments there to try to essentially give investors some confidence, except just kind of separating the good IPs from the bad, or the more successful IPs from the bad. That doesn't necessarily change how the company functions as a whole. So it's not necessarily an ideal solution either. It feels like a smoke and mirrors kind of a situation. And that's on top of, all the studio closures and layoffs and the game flops and the myriad delays and cancellations, and just about everything that could go wrong with the AAA publisher has gone wrong at Ubisoft. But now, most recently, the controversy that they face from the gaming audience is what they said about their belief in regards to game ownership. Recall that back in 2023, the crew was delisted from all digital storefronts, and then when servers shut down in early 2024, specifically on April 1st, 2024, which is appropriate because this feels like a freaking joke, Ubisoft not only decided that the game would no longer work for the people who purchased this game, but they also decided to delist and delete the crew from players' libraries, and with no compensation. Those who bought the crew at like a specific time frame before its closure did get money back, but the people who bought the game prior to that essentially had the game completely delisted and removed from their library. It essentially felt like highway robbery, except for players' libraries, which is why we've seen things like the Stop Killing Games initiative that has garnered hundreds of thousands of petition signatures, and that has essentially drawn the attention of government officials, namely in the UK and Europe, which are regions that are very active about consumer protections and the like, so that's a good thing. And then furthermore, Ubisoft got sued for shutting down the crew by various individuals, specifically two Californians, who kind of describe the situation as like, imagine you have a pinball machine and the company decides to just enter your home and take that pinball machine away from you because they deemed it that the license for that pinball machine has expired. It's just robbery, essentially. And this has garnered enough attention that California, back in September of 2024, decided to enforce a law that essentially forces digital storefronts to very explicitly state that when you buy a game, you do not own it. You are not really buying it. You're just licensing the content. And that has forced outlets like Steam to kind of essentially put up a sign that says when you buy this game, you're not really buying it. You're only, getting a license for the product. And that is something that proved to be rather revealing, to the point where, tweets discussing this garnered, almost 20 million views, hundreds of thousands of likes, so on and so forth. And people essentially putting out the idea that, if you don't own the games you buy, then I guess pirating them isn't really stealing, among other takes like these that have garnered, tens of thousands of likes, and people wanting refunds for the games that they've purchased where the disclaimer was not shown. So digital storefronts finally admit they have been scamming gamers all along, so on and so forth. Yeah, essentially. And the same applies for now Ubisoft, who, in response to lawsuits surrounding the crew, have insisted that players do not own the games that they buy. Right here we have an article from IGN covering this with a specific quote from Ubisoft's lawyer that reads as follows in regards to the lawsuits, claiming that the crew was misleading in the way it was advertised and people feel screwed over that this game that they bought, Ubisoft decided to essentially enforce a kill switch that negated their purchase, and that, it just feels like the product was stolen from their digital library. And that is a big issue with an all-digital future. That's why people prefer physical media, because currently the laws have not caught up to protect consumers from such moves and such actions. And so Ubisoft's lawyer said plaintiffs allege that they purchased physical copies of the crew under the belief that they were obtaining maintaining unfettered access to the game in perpetuity, which is how it used to work. If you still have a cartridge for an N64 game, that cartridge, license, whatever bullshit aside, you can plug it in and play it whenever you want. And, Nintendo, game companies, the publishers of the game cannot do anything about that. That is yours forever, so long as the cartridge works and the console works. Whereas in this day and age, when you purchase a digital product, it is all completely up to the companies and the publishers' ability to maintain licenses and servers and whatnot, and just, their willingness to grant you access that essentially defines whether you get to play the game or not. And chances are that years down the line, decades down the line, you will lose access to much of your digital content because companies can just do that. And so that's just not how it used to be back in the day, when physical media and your ability to truly own that physical media and do what you want with it was more prominent. Even physical media in this day and age, discs and whatnot, technically, don't have all the game data in them a lot of the times. And so you have to do additional downloads to be able to play the game. So the physical media ultimately is still pointless. And so it really is a major concern that needs to be tackled by the law. The statement continues, plaintiffs also take issue with the fact that Ubisoft did not offer to create an offline single-player option of the game, otherwise known as a patch, when it shut down the Crew servers in March of 2024. The thing is, when you play the Crew, it is a game that can function as a single-player experience. It should be entirely possible to make the game accessible as a single-player game. It's not going to be as much fun as if it had all of the multiplayer features, but it is a piece of software that people should be able to access, even if online servers have gone off and they can't play with other players, but they can kind of explore the game themselves. But Ubisoft has sort of made that decision for consumers. So the Ubisoft lawyer continues here. The essence of the plaintiff's complaint is that Ubisoft allegedly misled purchasers of its video game The Crew into believing they were purchasing unfettered ownership rights in the game rather than a limited license to access the game. But the reality is that consumers received the benefit of their bargain and were explicitly notified at the time of purchase that they were purchasing a license. And the way the lawyer justifies this quote-unquote explicit notification that you're just purchasing a license and not buying the game is that the Xbox and PlayStation package contain a clear and conspicuous notice in all capital letters that Ubisoft may cancel access to one or more specific online features upon a 30-day prior notice. But they didn't just cancel access to online features for the Crew. They made sure that the Crew itself as a piece of software would not be accessible in any way, shape, or form, were completely removed from players' libraries. It's not that they left the software in players' libraries, but because it was an online game, they couldn't run it. It was like they just removed the game outright from players, despite the fact that they purchased this piece of software, on top of the fact that they did not apply some kind of offline patch that would have probably been relatively simple to implement, or, very feasible to implement, but they decided, they were going to do it their own way, which was to essentially tell customers, thank you for the money you spent on this game. We're going to be taking it back now, regardless of whether we have your consent or not. And then in Polygon's coverage of this whole situation, we'll find further quotes from lawyers that further insults consumers and gamers with the following quote: plaintiffs apply a kitchen sink approach on behalf of a putative class of nationwide customers, stating that some of the violations that Ubisoft is being accused of include California's false advertising law, unfair competition law, and Consumer Legal Remedies Act, as well as the common law fraud and breach of warranty claims. So when a lawyer says it's a kitchen sink approach, it essentially means that they're throwing darts until it hits something, that they're arguing in bad faith, and that they're just kind of coming up with as many arguments as possible until something hits. It essentially insinuates that this is them exploiting the law or something to try to get some kind of justice out of a situation that is less than ideal for them. And while the exact letter of the law may potentially allow a corporation to get away with their nefarious shenanigans, it doesn't mean that that is a morally correct thing. That doesn't mean that the law is working as intended. It just means that laws have to be updated so that they cover situations like these, that these laws should be able to kind of protect consumers with. Like they say here that California's false advertising law doesn't apply to this game because they had a notice in the packaging, clear and conspicuous, the lawyer claims, in all capital letters, that Ubisoft may cancel access to one or more specific online features upon a 30-day prior notice. But not only does that not cover the fact that the game has been removed from libraries altogether, like completely nuked from people's libraries. It doesn't change the fact that this is the equivalent of fine print that just a lot of people don't get clear notification of. The fact that so many, your average Joes don't know that when you buy a game, you're not really buying a game, but only a license, goes to highlight that companies are not doing enough to really convey to people what it is they're spending money on. Only people who are hardcore gamers and follow gaming news, who are kind of really in tune with all this stuff, are aware of this, but the general public have no idea that when they buy a game, their ability to access that game is not up to them at all. And so sure, a company like Ubisoft could argue that they're not technically violating California's false advertising law because they put some fine print in there, but clearly they're not doing a good job at advertising correctly, as many consumers are unaware of the nature of their purchase. And so if companies like Ubisoft are allowed to get away with this, that means that this law is not doing its job. And even if people were aware of the fact that when they buy games, they're not really buying them, it doesn't change the fact that such a thing is allowed. It's just, by its nature, immoral. The fact that your purchases are ultimately, in terms of your autonomy over them, you don't possess any real autonomy over products that you purchase. That is something that should be questioned. That is something that laws should not allow. But yeah, the company's lawyers argues here that plaintiffs don't have a case, be it because of a statute of limitations or no real cognizable injury, and what they describe as inadequate arguments. Wow, no cognizable injury. They believe that when consumers spend money on something and believing that when they buy it, they actually, bought it, and then they discover that that's not the case, and the product that they purchased was taken away from them, effectively making it a situation where Ubisoft essentially just stole money from people. The fact that the lawyer perceives that as no real cognizable injury just highlights how little fucks companies give about consumers, and the fact that they worked hard to spend the money that they did on video games. Now, fortunately, the plaintiffs here are not taking this lying down. One of the responses that they had was to Ubisoft's argument about the statute of limitations being up. But something that plaintiffs noted is that in Ubisoft's own photos of the crew's packaging, this is something that the lawyer brought up as, being evidence that, there's text there letting people know the nature of their purchase. What plaintiffs pointed out is that it does state in the packaging that the activation code for the game does not expire until 2099. So even if the license argument holds, that license should be able to hold up till 2099. And people should have access to the game till 2099 because that's what the packaging actually says. So in reality, Ubisoft did actually falsely advertise in their own packaging. So the lawyer kind of screwed themselves there by presenting the packaging and the fine print in the packaging argument. And folks who purchased the crew believing this to be the case, where the game would be available for long stretches of time for the long term, or have permanent access to it, were not really warned that the game would shut down and just be removed from the library when it did happen. And so, yeah, it's actually not a good argument at all on the part of the lawyer. And then beyond that, something else that plaintiffs argued on March 18th, 2025 was that Ubisoft might be breaking rules surrounding sale of gift certifications. Specifically in California, gift cards cannot expire. And Ubisoft, technically, when you look at the crew and the fact that its microtransactions currency system expired out of the blue, there is an argument that, this could be considered Ubisoft violating that specific law in California where gift cards cannot expire by shutting down the game prematurely. That's one area that the plaintiffs are trying to pursue. Should be interesting to see whether the judges and the letter of the law ultimately allow the plaintiffs to get away with this argument. But either way, the plaintiffs are correct in that there is something morally questionable, morally completely wrong about a corporation being able to have full-fledged control over the content that you purchase. Plenty of folks have already gotten wind of Ubisoft just essentially telling the corporate truth, like what they truly believe in and just how little fucks they actually give about consumers. This is them, like their mask slipping off because they have to take off their mask during lawsuits and law cases. And so, with folks reporting on this on social media outlets like Twitter, you can see the millions of views and tens of thousands of likes and people essentially encouraging piracy for Ubisoft titles if this is the attitude they want to take, where you don't own the products you spend money on and whatnot. Ridiculous. And so people are like, hey, if buying games is not owning them, then pirating is not stealing. And this stuff tends to garner hundreds of thousands of views, tens of thousands of likes, so on and so forth. Same thing goes for this Exerto report that also garnered, over 1.1 million views, tens of thousands of likes, and people saying that, hey, if buying a game means I don't own it, then pirating the game means I didn't steal it. And, logically speaking, I guess there's some truth to that if that's the approach that, game companies want to take. And I mean, there are already storefronts that prove that you can do, DRM-free digital products that you can have an all-digital future, but still do it in a way that's consumer-friendly, where people still gain full access to their game and full autonomy over their digital products. So GOG, for example, they actually made fun of the fact that so many digital storefronts have DRM and restrict your ability to access your products, or your ability to access the products is fully dependent on the services rather than on you. And so GOG is like, if there was only a storefront that actually lets you own your games, GOG actually lets you do that. And yes, still the license belongs to the companies that publish the games. But, if licenses have, problems or go away, and if storefronts shut down, as long as you have the game files that you've downloaded from GOG, it's like owning that physical media, where regardless of license or whatever, they cannot go into your computer and take away your installer of the game, which is what GOG allows you to download with their DRM-free model. And so GOG is the exemplary example of how to do an all-digital future without compromising on, video game ownership and the like. And then furthermore, there's a whole notion of, games disappearing, games not being preserved because of situations like The Crew, where they can just nuke the game from existence, remove them from players' libraries, and make them completely inaccessible and unplayable, which is why outlets like the Video Game History Foundation did research highlighting how, as of, July of 2023, 87% of classic video games have completely disappeared from the face of the planet, which is absolutely ridiculous, as in there is no reasonable way to purchase them digitally. And I mean, for ones that do have some kind of physical version, the costs for them, because of their rarity, are so outlandish that they may as well have disappeared. And so ROMs and emulation are the only thing that have saved the vast majority of these games. But, there's some legal murkiness surrounding that aspect of things, and game companies are trying to take down ROMs and emulation when they're the only form of preservation. Like, they're completely off the market, they're not being sold, and they've made it completely inaccessible. So yeah, people will resort to ROMs and emulation since it's the only method to access the games that they've tried to nuke off the planet, or that they were so complacent in terms of not keeping up with preserving those games that people have no other option but to emulate ROMs. Video game companies are so against the idea of games preservation that they even argued against this motion by the Video Game History Foundation to the US Copyright Office that video games should be allowed to have like a library style system where, like books and libraries that hold books where you can access them for free as well as purchase them, there should be a way to like have video games be kind of permanently preserved in libraries and museums and whatnot, in a way that people can access. Or what game publishers argued is that the preserved video games will be used for recreational purposes, but a lot of those games aren't even being sold on the market, so what do you care if they're being played for recreational purposes? And I mean, that's kind of what happens with books and libraries. Aside from the preservation aspect, people do rent out books from libraries because, yeah, they kind of want to read them for recreational purposes. It serves a multifaceted kind of purpose. And so video games having a similar thing where, people can go to libraries and rent those things out. It's just one form of preservation and giving people access to games. But the alternative of being able to sell those games on the market and stuff, and that being a more convenient form of kind of ownership, that's still there as an option. Libraries haven't tanked the sales of books, and similarly, a library for video games would not tank the sales of video games. So companies arguing against just the most basic form of preservation, preservation systems and kind of preservation motions and moves and initiatives that actually make a whole lot of sense and, would ultimately be a win for everyone, just goes to highlight the level of greed and short-sightedness and the level of anti-consumerism that is at play amongst the corporate heads who only really think selfishly about themselves and what benefits the corporation. And it's just disgusting to see, but it's also very illuminating to see the likes of Ubisoft just, have their lawyers flat out say, hey, if you buy our games, you don't own them. Well, then I encourage people to not buy Ubisoft games, as you technically can't really buy them. Even if they advertise, the products as being purchasable, you're not really purchasing them. you're renting them, as the crew proved and as Ubisoft, per their lawyer, essentially stated directly to your face. Or at the very least, that's one man's take. Let me know in the comments below what your thoughts and opinions are on this whole Ubisoft situation with their lawyer stating that you don't, in fact, own the games you buy, which is technically, legally speaking, they can get away with, but they just shouldn't be able to, and there should be consumer protection laws to mitigate the ability for corporations to have that level of autonomy and control over the digital content that you own. That's my take. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.